At my fifth wedding anniversary party, my father-in-law stood in front of 400 elite guests and publicly called me a charity case who scrubs dirt for a living. When my husband joined in the cruel laughter echoing across the ballroom, I did not burst into tears or run away. I simply smiled, reached into my purse, and prepared to make a single phone call to the one woman capable of destroying their entire empire overnight: my mother. My name is Maddie, 33 years old, and I spent half a decade shrinking my existence to stroke the fragile egos of my wealthy in-laws. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who severely underestimated your worth. The crystal chandeliers of the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club cast a glittering light over the grand ballroom. 400 of the city's most influential politicians, investors, and socialites were seated at tables draped in white silk. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted duck. It was supposed to be a celebration of my 5 years of marriage to Carter Reynolds. Instead, it was an execution of my dignity. Richard Reynolds, my 65-year-old father-in-law, stood at the front podium tapping his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The room fell into a respectful hush. Richard was the patriarch of the Reynolds commercial real estate firm, a man who built his entire personality around intimidating those he deemed beneath his tax bracket. From the day Carter proposed, Richard made it entirely clear that my career as a freelance art restorer was nothing more than peasant work. For 5 years, I swallowed his casual cruelty. I endured the family dinners where Richard would serve me grocery store wine while pouring $100 vintage Bordeaux for his blood relatives. I stayed silent when he intentionally left me out of family portraits. I convinced myself that keeping the peace was the mature choice. I convinced myself that Carter loved me enough to make up for his family's toxic behavior. Richard adjusted his designer tie and leaned into the microphone. His voice boomed across the silent ballroom. 5 years ago, my son Carter took a vow. We all know Carter. He is the brilliant vice president of our firm, a man carrying the heavy weight of the Reynolds family empire squarely on his shoulders. And he does it with grace. But behind every exhausted executive is a wife holding down the fort. Richard paused, his lips curling into a condescending smirk. He looked directly at my table. Let us raise a glass to my lovely daughter-in-law, Maddie. A sweet little charity case who happily stays down in her basement scrubbing dirt off old canvas, while my son actually builds the future of this city. To Maddie and her little art hobby. A wave of awkward, mocking laughter rippled through the ballroom. I turned to look at my husband, desperately hoping to see anger in his eyes, hoping he would stand up and defend the woman he married. Instead, Carter was chuckling along with his father, swirling the amber liquid in his whiskey glass, looking mildly embarrassed by my mere presence. The heat of supreme humiliation flushed my cheeks, but it was instantly replaced by an ice-cold clarity. The blindfold I had worn for 5 years suddenly fell away. I was not a partner to Carter. I was a prop. I was a convenient punching bag for a family of narcissistic bullies. I did not shrink down into my silk chair. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The scraping sound of wood against marble echoed sharply, cutting through the scattered laughter. I walked purposefully toward the nearest waiter, plucked the spare wireless microphone from his tray, and turned to face Richard. The room went dead silent. 400 pairs of wealthy eyes locked onto me. Thank you for that heartwarming toast, Richard, I said, my voice steady and amplified across the vast room. And speaking of my little art hobby, I actually just finished scrubbing the dirt off that 17th century Baroque landscape you sneaked into my basement last month. You know the one. The $2 million masterpiece you specifically begged me to restore completely off the books so you could hide the asset from the IRS. A collective audible gasp shattered the silence of the ballroom. Several investors at the front tables physically recoiled. The smug grin on Richard's face instantly dissolved, replaced by a sickening shade of pale gray. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. Maddie, shut your mouth right now, Richard hissed, though the microphone picked up his panicked whisper perfectly. "Oh, I am just celebrating your brilliant financial strategies, Richard," I replied, tilting my head with a sickeningly sweet smile. After all, it takes a special kind of genius to commit federal tax fraud while simultaneously insulting the only person holding the evidence. The whispers erupted instantly. High society wives leaned into their husbands, their eyes wide with scandal. A prominent bank executive seated near the front row slowly set his champagne glass down, his expression hardening as he stared at Richard. In the world of commercial real estate, perception was currency, and I had just set Richard's vault on fire. I watched my husband Carter spring up from his seat, his face contorted with a mixture of absolute terror and narcissistic rage. He was storming toward me, his hands balled into tight fists, completely unmasking the polished gentleman routine he sold to the public. The war had officially begun, and they had absolutely no idea who they had just provoked. Carter closed the distance between us in seconds. His expensive Italian leather shoes slapped aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. Before I could say another word, he lunged forward and violently yanked the microphone out of my hand. A sharp squeal of audio feedback pierced the ballroom, making several guests cover their ears in shock. But Carter did not care about the noise. He only cared about his shattered ego. "Are you completely out of your mind?" he screamed, his voice raw and echoing without the microphone. The veins in his neck were bulging against his silk collar. "You ungrateful, bitter peasant! How dare you stand up here and try to embarrass my family?" I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight. I looked into the eyes of the man I had slept next to for 5 years, suddenly realizing I was looking at a complete stranger. Or perhaps, I was finally looking at his true self. "You are just jealous," Carter continued to rant, stepping so close I could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. "You have always been jealous of our success, of our high society connections. You contribute absolutely nothing to this family, except your little arts and crafts projects, and now you throw a temper tantrum because my father spoke the truth." His words were designed to crush me, but they only served to unlock a vault of suppressed memories. As he yelled, the reality of our entire marriage flashed before my eyes. I remembered the day we signed the lease on our luxury penthouse in the financial district. His family loved to brag about his lavish lifestyle, but none of these 400 elite guests knew the truth. They did not know that I was the one who quietly paid the $80,000 security deposit from my hard-earned savings. I paid it because Carter had secretly blown his trust fund on a terrible commercial investment and was too terrified to tell Richard. I remembered canceling my own gallery exhibitions just to stand quietly by his side at endless real estate galas. I spent 5 entire years smiling like a decorative ornament so he could feel like the most important man in the room. I ironed his shirts, managed his schedules, and absorbed his daily complaints about his incompetent coworkers. I shrank my ambitions, dimmed my own light, and completely hid my true identity just to protect the fragile ego of a fundamentally mediocre man. I had convinced myself that my silence was an act of profound love. Today, I realized it was an act of complete self-betrayal. Carter mistook my silent observation for fear. He assumed the slight flush in my cheeks was the beginning of a pathetic emotional breakdown. He loved it when I looked weak, because it fueled his raging narcissism. He turned to a terrified waiter standing nearby, snatched a white linen cocktail napkin from the silver serving tray, and aggressively shoved it against my chest. "Wipe your tears and act properly or get out of my sight." Carter snapped, his upper lip curling in disgust. The tension in the ballroom finally broke, not with sympathy for a publicly humiliated wife, but with a wave of mocking laughter. It started at the front VIP table with Penelope, my arrogant sister-in-law, who let out a loud theatrical giggle. Her husband Andre, the hotshot corporate lawyer, leaned back in his chair and smirked. He shook his head slowly, as if he were watching a pathetic comedy show. Within seconds, the sycophants and business partners in the room joined in chuckling at the supposed charity case wife being put back in her place by the powerful Reynolds heir. They laughed because they believed I was a trapped animal. They laughed because they thought I had zero leverage, zero money, and nowhere else to go. But I did not shed a single tear. The profound sadness that had weighed heavily on my chest for half a decade simply evaporated. It was replaced by an intoxicating wave of cold, calculated indifference. I looked down at the crumpled linen napkin resting against my designer dress. I let it fall to the floor and deliberately stepped right over it, leaving a faint scuff mark on the pristine white fabric. I did not scream back at him. I did not hurl a desperate insult to defend my honor. I simply looked at Carter with an expression of absolute pity. The kind of pity you reserve for a spoiled child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. His face twitched, clearly unsettled by my complete lack of submission. Without uttering another syllable, I turned my back on him. I walked away from the podium, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor, cutting straight through the center of the grand ballroom. The mocking laughter slowly died down as the guests parted like the Red Sea to let me through. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors leading to the grand foyer and walked straight into the women's marble restroom. It was time to stop playing the victim. It was time to make the call. The women's restroom was a sanctuary of silence. The heavy mahogany door shut behind me, completely severing the chaotic noise of the ballroom. I walked over to the gilded mirrors lining the wall and turned on the gold faucet. The cold water splashed against my wrist, grounding me in reality. I looked at my reflection. The woman staring back at me was no longer the submissive, quiet wife trying to shrink herself into a mold that was never meant to hold her. I took a deep breath, reached into my silver clutch, and pulled out my phone. For 5 years I had kept my two worlds entirely separate. When I met Carter, I introduced myself simply as Maddie. I completely dropped my last name because I desperately wanted to be loved for who I was, not for the billions of dollars attached to my family legacy. I wanted a normal life. I wanted a husband who looked at me and saw a supportive partner, not a walking trust fund to be exploited. My mother had warned me against it from the very beginning. Josephine Sinclair was not a woman who believed in fairy tales. At 60 years old, she was the founder and CEO of Sinclair Holdings, a private equity firm that ruthlessly controlled a massive portion of Wall Street. She was a self-made apex predator in a financial world completely dominated by men. She wore custom-tailored blazers, drank black coffee, and dismantled corporate empires before her morning meetings. When I first told her I was marrying Carter Reynolds, she had a comprehensive background check run on his entire family within 24 hours. She sat me down in her corner office overlooking the Manhattan skyline and told me the Reynolds family was nothing but a fragile house of cards. She warned me they were built on bad commercial debt and unearned arrogance, obsessed with maintaining an illusion of extreme wealth. But I was stubborn and desperately in love. I actually thought my devotion could change Carter. So my mother made a strict deal with me. She would let me walk away and make my own mistakes. She would let me live my quiet life, restore my paintings in the basement, and play the role of the humble wife. But she promised that the exact moment I realized my own worth, she would be waiting. My thumb hovered over her name in my contacts. I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear. It rang only one time. "Hello, Madeline," her voice echoed through the speaker. It was crisp, authoritative, and completely devoid of surprise. It was as if she had been sitting at her mahogany desk for 5 entire years just waiting for this exact phone call to happen. "Mom?" I said, my voice steady but quiet. My throat felt tight, but not from sadness. It was the overwhelming relief of finally surrendering the facade I had maintained for so long. "Please come." There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the faint sound of thick paper files shuffling in the background, followed by the sharp click of her expensive pen tapping against a glass desk. "I gave you 5 years to play house with those parasitic frauds, Maddie," she replied, her tone dropping into a dangerous, ice-cold register that commanded absolute authority. 5 years of letting them treat my only daughter like she was the hired help. I assume the trial period is officially over. It is over. I confirmed, squaring my shoulders as I looked deeply into my own eyes in the mirror. I am completely done playing the victim. Good, my mother said. The heavy sound of a solid wood office door opening echoed through the phone. Do not shed another single tear for that mediocre man. Stand up straight. Remember exactly whose blood runs in your veins. I am 10 minutes away. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone, staring at the black screen for a long moment. A strange electric energy began to pulse through my veins. The Reynolds family truly thought they held all the power because they owned a failing commercial real estate firm and a membership to a snobby golf club. They thought they could publicly humiliate a defenseless woman and walk away without a single scratch. They were about to learn a catastrophic lesson in actual power dynamics. I opened my clutch, pulled out my favorite shade of crimson lipstick, and carefully applied it. I smoothed the fabric of my evening gown and took one last look in the mirror. The scared, accommodating wife was gone. Madeline Sinclair was fully awake. I turned off the faucet, grabbed my bag, and pushed the heavy restroom doors open, ready to step back into the snake pit. I did not need to run or hide anymore. I just needed to stall them until the shark arrived. I pushed the heavy restroom doors open, stepping out of the quiet sanctuary and back into the sprawling marble foyer of the country club. The air was still thick with the distant hum of the ballroom, but out here the lighting was dimmer, casting long shadows across the intricate Persian rugs. I adjusted the thin gold strap of my evening clutch and started walking purposefully toward the grand exit. My plan was simple. I fully intended to wait for my mother outside in the crisp night air, far away from the toxic fumes of my husband's family. But my exit was abruptly cut short. Standing dead center in the middle of the hallway, perfectly blocking the heavy glass doors, were my sister-in-law, Penelope, and her husband, Andre. Penelope stood with her arms tightly crossed over her designer dress, her sharp features twisted into a mask of pure condescension. Next to her was Andre, a senior partner at a mid-sized corporate law firm, who never missed a single opportunity to remind everyone of his exorbitant billable rate. As a wealthy corporate lawyer, Andre had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to prove he belonged in the Reynolds inner circle. He constantly sought Richard's approval, and he usually earned it by joining in on the family tradition of tearing me down. Tonight was clearly no exception to his rule. As I walked closer, the rhythmic clicking of my heels echoing off the walls, neither of them moved an inch to let me pass. Andre adjusted the crisp cuffs of his bespoke suit, a smug, deeply self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. He held a thick stack of legal-sized papers bound securely by a heavy black clip. Before I could even politely ask them to step aside, Andre aggressively closed the distance between us. With a sharp, forceful motion, he slapped the heavy stack of documents directly against my chest. The sudden impact forced me to quickly bring my hands up to catch the papers before they scattered across the marble floor. "Sign it right now," Andre commanded, his voice dripping with arrogant, unearned authority. I looked down at the bold, capitalized letters printed on the very first page. Post-nuptial asset protection agreement. I let out a soft, breathy laugh of pure disbelief. "You actually brought a binding legal contract to a wedding anniversary party?" I asked, looking back up at his smug face. Penelope dramatically rolled her eyes and took a step forward, invading my personal space right alongside her husband. "Carter called us the second you walked out of that ballroom like a dramatic child." Penelope sneered, her voice shrill and grating against my ears. "He finally realized what a massive financial liability you are to this family. We are absolutely not going to let some bitter little gold digger try to take half of his commercial real estate empire just because her fragile feelings got hurt during a harmless toast. You are going to sign that document right now, relinquishing any future claim to his business assets, or you are never stepping foot inside that penthouse again." I stared at the two of them, genuinely marveling at the sheer depth of their financial delusion. Penelope actually believed her brother was a titan of industry. Andre actually believed he was executing a brilliant, ironclad legal maneuver. They were both completely blind to the terrifying reality of the Reynolds family finances. They actually thought Carter possessed an empire worth stealing. Carter wants to protect his massive empire from me, I repeated slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of the statement hang heavily in the air between us. Andre crossed his arms, puffing out his chest to look more physically intimidating. "Do not play dumb with me, Maddie," he warned, leaning his face closer to mine. "I drafted that document myself. It is legally airtight. Carter has been entirely too generous to you for the past 5 years, letting you live rent-free in a luxury high-rise while you play with cheap paintbrushes down in the basement. But tonight you crossed an unforgivable line. You publicly embarrassed the patriarch of this family. So here are your two options. You sign away your rights to the Reynolds commercial properties right here and now, or I will personally ensure the building management changes the electronic locks on your penthouse doors before you can even hail a cab." The heavy stack of paper weighed down my hands. I ran my thumb slowly over the crisp edge of the document. A normal woman without a safety net would be terrified by this ambush. A normal woman would be crying, begging for access to her own home, or frantically trying to call a cheap lawyer. But I was not a normal woman, and I certainly was not defenseless. I looked at the legal document, then looked back at Andre, noticing a very slight bead of sweat forming on his forehead despite his confident posture. He was trying to legally bully me into signing away my rights to a sinking ship, and he had absolutely no idea that I already held the deed to the ocean it was currently drowning in. I looked from the thick legal document in my hands to Andre's perfectly manicured fingers, and then up to his smug, expectant face. And for the first time that entire evening, I laughed. It was not a nervous giggle or a hysterical sob. It was a deep, genuine laugh that echoed off the high marble ceilings of the country club lobby. Penelope took a physical step back, her eyes widening in confusion. The smug smile on Andre's face instantly vanished, replaced by a deep scowl of offended authority. "What exactly is so funny?" Madeline Andre demanded, his voice dropping an octave as he tried to reassert his dominance. "This is a legally binding document. Refusing to sign it right now constitutes a hostile action against your husband and his estate." "His estate," I echoed, still smiling as I tapped the heavy paper against my palm. "Tell me something, Andre. As a highly paid senior partner specializing in corporate mergers, do you actually read the financial discovery files your law firm processes? Or do you just blindly stamp whatever Richard places on your desk so you can keep your expensive country club membership active?" "I am the lead counsel for Reynolds Commercial Real Estate." Andre snapped his chest, puffing out again as he leaned toward me. "I oversee every major transaction that goes through that office. Our portfolio is absolutely rock solid, and I will not stand here and be insulted by a woman who plays with paint for a living." "Rock solid," I repeated softly, letting the words hang heavily in the quiet air of the lobby. "Is that what they are teaching at Harvard Law these days? Because the last time I checked, a corporate empire that is currently 80% leveraged across all of its major commercial properties is not exactly rock solid. It is a fragile house of cards, just waiting for a strong breeze." The silence that followed was deafening. The arrogant posture completely drained from Andre's body. "Let us talk about the downtown plaza development." I continued, my voice dropping to a calm, conversational tone. The exact project Richard was just bragging about in the ballroom. "How do you legally classify 3 consecutive missed quarterly payments on a high-yield mezzanine loan? Because the major banks usually call that a severe default." Andre physically recoiled. His dark eyes darted nervously around the empty lobby, as if he expected to see federal banking regulators hiding behind the potted palms. The confident, arrogant lawyer routine completely shattered in an instant. He reached up and nervously adjusted his silk tie, suddenly looking like a terrified intern caught shredding the wrong documents. "I have no idea what ridiculous delusions you are spouting." Andre stammered, his voice suddenly pitching higher and faster. "But if you have been illegally accessing Carter's private briefcase in the penthouse, you are violating strict corporate non-disclosure agreements. That is textbook corporate espionage, Madeline. I could have you federally indicted for stealing classified financial trade secrets. You are entirely out of your depth. I will file an injunction so fast it will make your head spin. I did not need to dig through Carter's disorganized briefcase to know your business is bleeding cash, Andre, I replied effortlessly. The financial world is remarkably small and the banks talk. Right now they are practically screaming. You brought a post-nuptial agreement to protect a fortune that simply does not exist. You are waving a useless piece of paper at me to protect a pile of dust. Penelope, completely ignorant to the terrifying reality of their actual business operations, stepped aggressively in front of her husband. She pointed a sharp acrylic nail directly at my face, her face twisted in rage. "You are completely delusional!" Penelope yelled, her voice echoing shrilly in the corridor. "My father is a titan in this city. Carter is closing a massive $50 million merger tomorrow morning that will double our net worth. You are just a pathetic, jealous woman trying to sound smart because you know my brother is about to kick you out on the street with absolutely nothing." I looked at Penelope with pure pity. She was standing there wearing a diamond tennis bracelet, bought entirely with borrowed bank money, fiercely defending a legacy built on staggering debt. It was almost tragic to watch. Andre, however, was not yelling anymore. He was staring at me in total silence. His sharp legal mind was frantically trying to calculate how the quiet art restorer knew the exact percentage of their highly classified leveraged assets. He knew I was right, and the sheer panic radiating from his rigid posture was palpable. He opened his mouth to spout another desperate legal threat to cover his tracks, but the sound of angry approaching footsteps interrupted him. The angry footsteps belonged to Carter. He burst through the heavy mahogany doors, his face still flushed a deep, ugly crimson from the ballroom confrontation. He marched straight toward us, aggressively yanking at his expensive silk tie, as if the fabric were suddenly suffocating him. He stopped right beside his sister, squaring his shoulders to form a united front of sheer Reynolds family arrogance. "What exactly is going on out here?" Carter barked, glaring at me before turning to Andre. "Is she giving you trouble with the post-nuptial agreement? Your wife seems to be suffering from a severe psychotic break." Penelope chimed in, immediately, pointing a sharp acrylic nail at my face. "She is standing here insulting Andre's legal expertise and making up completely ridiculous lies about the company's financial status." Carter whipped his head back toward me, his eyes narrowing into dark, hateful slits. For a brief, fleeting second, I actually saw a raw flash of panic in his pupils. He knew I handled the household accounting. He knew I saw the bright red late notices buried beneath his golf magazines on the kitchen island. But his fragile, narcissistic pride would never allow him to admit weakness in front of his sister and her highly successful husband. "You really do not know when to keep your mouth shut, do you, Maddie?" Carter snarled, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "You embarrassed my father in front of 400 of the most important investors in this city, and now you are out here disrespecting my family. You think because you washed a few dirty paintings you suddenly understand high-level corporate finance. I understand basic math." "Carter," I replied evenly, not backing down a single inch, "which is clearly more than anyone else in your bloodline can say." "That is enough!" Carter yelled, his voice echoing loudly against the marble pillars of the lobby. "I am completely done playing games with you. You want to act like a defiant, ungrateful brat. Then you can live exactly like one. As of right now, I am cutting off every single credit card in your wallet. Do not even think about calling a cab on my dime." He pointed a shaking finger toward the heavy glass exit doors leading out to the valet stand. "And do not bother going back to the apartment." Carter continued, his voice dripping with venomous, triumphant satisfaction. "I am texting the building concierge right now. I am telling them to deactivate your key fob and permanently lock you out of the penthouse. Let us see how arrogant you feel when you are sleeping on the streets tonight." Penelope crossed her arms, a cruel smirk spreading across her face. She looked at me as if I were a piece of garbage waiting to be swept out the back door. Andre stood silently, though his sharp lawyer eyes darted nervously between me and Carter, trying to read the shifting dynamic. I looked down at the polished marble floor, took a deep, steadying breath, and let out a soft, pitying sigh. When I looked back up, the triumphant sneer on Carter's face faltered just a fraction. "Cut off my credit cards," I asked, my voice calm, level, and completely devoid of fear. "You mean the platinum cards that are registered under my personal social security number? The ones that currently have a zero balance because I actually pay my bills on time every month?" Carter blinked rapidly, momentarily thrown off balance by the cold reality of my statement. "And lock me out of the penthouse?" I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "That is a fascinating legal threat, Carter. I am incredibly curious to see how the luxury building management handles a request to lock out the primary leaseholder." Penelope scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. "Stop lying, Maddie. Everyone knows Carter pays for that luxury apartment." "Does he?" I asked, turning my gaze to Penelope, whose confident expression suddenly wavered. I turned back to my furious husband. "Did you tell your sister the truth about our apartment, Carter? Did you tell your brilliant corporate lawyer brother-in-law exactly how we secured that lease?" Carter's face went from flushed red to a sickly pale white in a matter of seconds. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. "Shut up right now, Maddie. 3 years ago, I said, raising my voice just enough to ensure Andre and Penelope heard every single syllable clearly. Carter decided to play real estate tycoon without his father's permission. He sank his entire trust fund into a disastrous commercial strip mall project on the east side. It went bankrupt in 6 months. Richard was so furiously embarrassed he completely froze Carter's accounts. "I told you to shut up," Carter hissed, stepping forward as if he wanted to physically clamp his hand over my mouth. "So when it came time to sign the lease for that beautiful 5,000-square-foot penthouse," I pressed on my voice, cutting through the lobby like a sharpened steel blade. Carter did not have a single dime to his name. I was the one who quietly wired the $80,000 security deposit and the first month's rent. I paid for it using the money I earned from my little art hobby. I watched the devastating realization wash over Penelope's face. She turned slowly to look at her brother, her eyes wide with shock and sudden, undeniable disgust. In the Reynolds family, the only sin worse than being poor was losing money and looking like a fool. Carter had managed to do both, and I had just exposed his deepest, most shameful financial failure to the very people he constantly tried to impress. "So, go ahead, Carter," I challenged, pulling my phone out of my evening clutch and holding it out toward his chest. "Call the concierge. Tell them to lock out the woman who actually pays the rent on your fake luxury life. I absolutely dare you." Carter stood entirely frozen, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air. He did not reach for my phone. He did not call my bluff because he knew it was the absolute truth. The heavy silence in the lobby was suddenly broken by the sound of sharp, angry footsteps clapping against the marble floor. "Is this what we are doing now?" a deep, booming voice demanded. I turned to see Richard Reynolds marching through the grand double doors of the ballroom. His face was a mask of pure, concentrated fury. He had clearly noticed the extended absence of his son and his lawyer son-in-law, and he had come to squash whatever rebellion I was supposedly staging. As soon as Richard entered the space, the entire dynamic shifted. Carter visibly relaxed his shoulders, dropping as he stepped back to let his father take the lead. Penelope smirked, her confidence instantly restored by the presence of the family patriarch. Even Andre stood a little taller, eager to watch Richard execute the legal intimidation he had just failed to accomplish. Richard stopped a few feet away from me, his cold eyes sweeping over the scene. He looked at the thick stack of legal papers I was still holding, then looked at Carter with an expression of profound disappointment. "I told you to handle this quietly, Carter," Richard scolded, not even bothering to look at me yet. "I told you to get her signature before the appetizers were served. Now you have half the ballroom whispering about why the guest of honor stormed out like a petulant child." He finally turned his gaze to me. It was the same look of utter disdain he had given me on the very first day we met. To Richard, I was not a human being. I was an accounting error, a bad investment his son had made that needed to be aggressively written off. You really thought you did something clever in there, Maddie, Richard said, his voice dangerously low. You thought throwing a little tantrum in front of my investors would give you some kind of leverage. Let me make something abundantly clear to you. You are a nobody. You came from nothing, you brought absolutely nothing to this family, and you are about to leave with nothing. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, just as his son had done moments before. But Richard was far more dangerous than Carter. Richard actually had the social power to back up his cruelty. You are very proud of your little art restoration business, Richard sneered, pointing a thick finger at my face. You think because you scrubbed a few canvases for my associates that you are somehow indispensable? Do you have any idea who I play golf with every Sunday? I sit on the board of directors for the Downtown Arts Council. I have lunch with the curators of the 3 biggest museums in this state. I stared back at him, my expression completely neutral, letting him dig his own grave with his arrogance. By 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Richard continued, his voice rising with vindictive pleasure. I will make exactly 3 phone calls. I will tell them that you are unstable, untrustworthy, and prone to destroying valuable assets. I will ensure that your name is completely blacklisted across the entire East Coast. You will never be hired to restore a finger painting, let alone a fine piece of art. Your little hobby is officially dead. Penelope let out a soft, mocking laugh. Carter crossed his arms, staring at me with a look of smug satisfaction. They were a pack of wolves entirely reliant on the alpha to do their hunting for them. Richard reached out and snatched the post-nuptial agreement directly out of my hands. He marched over to an antique mahogany console table resting against the lobby wall and slammed the heavy stack of papers down onto the polished wood. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo, pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen, and practically threw it on top of the contract. You are going to walk over to this table and sign your name on every single dotted line, Richard commanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. You are going to legally relinquish any ridiculous claim you think you have to my son's company, his assets, and his properties. And if I refuse, I asked softly, then you walk out those front doors right now. Richard fired back without a second of hesitation. You leave your phone, you leave your jewelry, and you walk out into the freezing night with nothing but that dress on your back. And I will personally stand here and watch the security guards throw you off the property. The family gang-up was completely textbook. It was the exact psychological warfare they used to break anyone who dared to question their authority. They surrounded the target, isolated them, threatened their livelihood, and demanded total submission. Richard looked at me, his chest heaving slightly, fully expecting the tears to finally fall. He expected me to walk over to that mahogany table, pick up his expensive gold pen, and sign my own financial death warrant out of pure, unadulterated fear. But I just looked at the pen, then looked toward the heavy glass doors of the country club entrance. The 10 minutes were almost up. I did not reach for the gold fountain pen. I did not take a single step toward the antique mahogany console table. Instead, I slowly met Richard's icy glare with absolute unbreakable calm. I let a long, tense moment pass between us, watching the thick veins in his neck begin to throb. I am not signing a single page of your worthless contract, Richard, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy air of the lobby. And I am certainly not walking out of here empty-handed. You do not own me. You do not own my business. And despite what you tell your wealthy friends over bad golf games, you barely even own your own real estate company. Richard's face contorted into a hideous mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He was completely unaccustomed to anyone, let alone a woman he deemed financially inferior, defying his direct orders. But it was Carter who completely lost whatever shred of sanity he had left. His father's presence had reinflated his fragile ego, and my flat refusal to submit was the ultimate public insult. Carter stepped forward, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. You arrogant, ungrateful little witch! Carter spat, his voice trembling with narcissistic rage. You think you can just stand here and disrespect my father in his own territory? You think you hold a single ounce of power in this building? Without waiting for my answer, Carter abruptly turned away from me, raised his hand high in the air, and snapped his fingers with a sharp, echoing crack. "Security!" Carter bellowed, his voice carrying aggressively toward the front entrance doors. "Security, get over here right now!" Instantly, two massive men wearing sharp black suits and discreet earpieces detached themselves from their posts near the valet stand. They moved with swift, practiced efficiency, their heavy boots thudding ominously against the polished marble floor. The country club hired these men, specifically to protect the elite from the outside world, but tonight, Carter was using them as his personal attack dogs. As they quickly approached our group, Carter pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly at my chest. "This woman is legally trespassing," Carter announced loudly to the head of security, a burly, intimidating man whose gold name tag read, "Jenkins." "She is causing a severe public disturbance at a private, highly exclusive family event. She is no longer welcome on these premises. I want her physically removed from this property immediately. Do not let her grab a coat. Do not let her call a cab. Just drag her out the front doors and throw her onto the street." Jenkins hesitated for a brief fraction of a second. His sharp eyes darted between my expensive evening gown and Carter's furious, flushed face. He recognized me. He knew I was the wife of the man giving the orders, the supposed guest of honor for this massive anniversary party. But in this fiercely exclusive club, the Reynolds family signed the checks and commanded the room. Ethics did not matter here, only the hierarchy of wealth. Penelope let out a delighted, malicious laugh, practically vibrating with excitement. She was eagerly waiting to see me humiliated, manhandled, and tossed onto the cold pavement like a piece of common trash. Andre folded his arms across his chest, a smug, highly satisfied smirk plastered on his face. As a lawyer, he knew exactly what Carter was doing, establishing absolute physical and legal dominance by treating me as an unwanted vagrant. The two large security guards closed the distance, stepping aggressively into my personal space. They positioned themselves on either side of me, completely blocking my path to the exit doors. Their massive frames cast dark, heavy shadows over me, creating an immediate, terrifying physical threat. The air in the lobby suddenly felt incredibly thin. This was no longer just a war of words or a battle over financial documents. My husband was actively commanding strange men to lay their hands on me. "Ma'am," Jenkins said, his voice deep, gravelly, and devoid of any warmth. He took one step closer, his massive hand hovering just inches from my bare shoulder, ready to grip my arm and forcibly march me out. "I need you to come with us right now. Do not make a scene, and do not make this difficult." Carter stood safely behind his wall of hired muscle, a sickeningly triumphant smile spreading across his face. He truly believed he had won. He believed the sheer physical intimidation of two massive security guards would finally break my spirit and force me to my knees. He expected me to cry, to beg, to frantically apologize to his father, to avoid being thrown onto the cold concrete. I looked at the heavy hand hovering over my shoulder, then looked up into Jenkins's hardened face. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not back down. Jenkins' massive hand remained suspended just inches from my bare shoulder. I could feel the heat radiating from his palm, a physical manifestation of the immediate threat hanging over me. The entire lobby seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the moment I would finally break, scream, or be forcefully dragged away. Instead, I slowly rotated my left wrist and looked down at my watch. 9 minutes and 45 seconds had passed since I hung up the phone in the marble restroom. Time was officially up. I shifted my gaze from the glowing face of my watch back to the hardened eyes of the head security guard. I did not raise my voice. I did not sound frantic, emotional, or desperate. I spoke with the quiet, chilling authority of a woman who held every single card in the deck. "Before you make the most catastrophic professional mistake of your entire career, Jenkins, I suggest you take a very deep breath and verify a piece of public record," I said smoothly. Jenkins froze. His thick brow furrowed in genuine confusion. As a luxury country club security guard, He was highly trained to handle screaming, intoxicated socialites or aggressive gatecrashers. He was completely unprepared for a woman facing imminent physical removal to speak to him with the calm, measured cadence of a commanding officer. Richard Reynolds might pay his exorbitant monthly membership dues to play golf here. I continued, my voice steady and unwavering. But he does not own the ground you are currently standing on. The Oak Ridge estate is leased land. You might want to radio your general manager and ask him exactly which private equity firm holds the master deed to this entire property before you dare to lay a single finger on my arm. The effect of my words was immediate. Jenkins slowly pulled his hand back just a fraction of an inch, his institutional self-preservation instinct overriding Carter's barking orders. Jenkins shot a quick, uncertain glance toward Richard, seeking confirmation or denial. That tiny, fleeting moment of hesitation from the hired muscle absolutely infuriated the Reynolds family. Penelope threw her head back and let out a loud, theatrical shriek of laughter that echoed sharply against the marble walls. "Are you actually listening to her?" Penelope shrieked, pointing her perfectly manicured finger at Jenkins. "She is completely out of her mind. She washes dirty canvas in a basement for a living, and now she thinks she is some kind of real estate mogul. She is having a psychotic breakdown right in front of us." Carter stepped forward, his face burning with the deep humiliation of his own security guard disobeying a direct command. "Grab her!" "Jenkins," Carter yelled, his voice cracking with unhinged rage. "Stop listening to this insane garbage. She is a desperate gold digger trying to buy time because she knows she has absolutely nothing left to her name. Throw her out onto the street right now." Andre shook his head slowly, adopting his most condescending performative lawyer persona. "This is frankly embarrassing to witness, Maddie." Andre sighed, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Claiming you own the country club. The Oak Ridge estate has been owned by a private holding corporation for 2 decades. Its assets are entirely insulated. You are making a complete fool of yourself. Just sign the post-nuptial agreement on the table and leave with whatever shred of dignity you have left." I looked at Andre, fighting the urge to smile. He was a corporate lawyer bragging about a holding corporation, completely unaware that the very holding corporation he was referencing belonged to my mother. But Jenkins was no longer listening to their insults. He was caught squarely in the middle of a war he did not understand, and his survival instincts were screaming at him to verify my claim. He reached up to press the button on his shoulder radio, intending to call the front desk manager to clear his own name. "If you do not remove this hysterical woman from my sight this very second, I will personally have your job," Richard roared, stepping directly into Jenkins's face. His face was a terrifying shade of purple. "I sit on the advisory board of this club. I will see to it that you never work in private security in this entire state again. Do you understand me?" The chaos peaked into a deafening crescendo. Carter tried to physically push past the security guards to grab my arm himself. Penelope was shouting insults, calling me crazy, delusional, and unhinged. Richard was aggressively threatening the staff. They were a swirling storm of narcissistic abuse, entirely convinced of their own untouchable supremacy. They were so blinded by their arrogant delusions that they could not see the actual reality closing in around them. I remained completely still. I did not defend myself against their rapid-fire insults. I simply stood my ground, watching my husband's face twist into an ugly mask of furious entitlement. They were all so incredibly confident in their imaginary kingdom. But the clock had finally run out, and the storm they had been begging for had officially arrived. Right on cue, the massive double doors of the country club entrance did not just open. They practically blew inward. A sharp, violent gust of cold evening air swept through the grand lobby, instantly dropping the temperature and rattling the heavy crystal prisms of the overhead chandeliers. Everyone froze in place. Richard stopped his tirade mid-sentence. Carter dropped his pointing hand. Penelope snapped her mouth shut, her theatrical laugh dying instantly in her throat. Even Jenkins and his massive security partner turned their heads in alarm. their hands instinctively reaching toward the heavy utility belts at their waists. Stepping over the polished brass threshold was not the tragic, impoverished mother figure the Reynolds family had spent the last 5 years loudly imagining. It was Josephine Sinclair. At 60 years old, my mother did not merely walk. She glided with the terrifying, predatory grace of a woman who owned every single room she ever entered. She was draped in a custom-tailored charcoal Armani suit that fit her with razor-sharp precision. A luxurious midnight blue cashmere coat was draped effortlessly over her shoulders, undisturbed by the harsh winter wind outside. Under the bright lobby lights, the subtle, unmistakable gleam of a diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe watch flashed on her left wrist. Her silver hair was styled into a sleek, immaculate bob, framing a face carved from pure ice and absolute unquestionable authority. She did not look like a woman who rode the city bus. She looked like a woman who bought the bus company just to aggressively fire the board of directors. Flanking her on either side were 2 towering executive assistants. They were dressed in identical, impeccably tailored black suits, wearing the kind of neutral, highly calculating expressions usually reserved for federal agents. Each assistant gripped a heavy combination locked leather briefcase. As a corporate lawyer, Andre immediately recognized the premium Italian leather of those briefcases, and his eyes darted nervously to the men holding them. Inside those cases were the comprehensive financial dossiers that would soon turn the Reynolds family legacy into a smoldering pile of ash. The sheer concentrated aura of power radiating from my mother hit the lobby like a physical shockwave. True wealth does not need to scream brag or throw embarrassing public tantrums the way Carter just did. True wealth demands absolute silence. And the silence that suddenly fell over that marble foyer was deafening. Jenkins and the other security guard felt the shift instantly. These men spent their entire careers guarding the local elite, and they possessed a highly tuned survivalist radar for recognizing people who could ruin their lives with a single quiet phone call. Without anyone giving a verbal order, both security guards immediately lowered their hands. They took 3 large, synchronized steps backward, completely clearing the space around me. The physical threat they had posed just seconds ago evaporated into thin air. They no longer answered to Carter or Richard. Their institutional instincts told them the real boss had just entered the building. My mother did not even look at the security guards as they retreated. She did not look at Penelope, who was staring open-mouthed at the expensive cashmere coat, her brain failing to process the sight. She did not look at Andre, whose sharp lawyer eyes were rapidly assessing the unmistakable high-level corporate threat of the 2 assistants. And she certainly did not look at Carter, who was blinking rapidly, completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in gravity. Josephine Sinclair locked her piercing blue eyes directly on me. She walked with a steady, rhythmic click of her designer heels against the marble floor, completely ignoring the chaotic tension that had just consumed the space. The crowd of wealthy guests lingering near the ballroom entrance instinctively parted ways for her, backing up against the walls, sensing the arrival of an apex predator. She stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. She reached out her cool, perfectly manicured hand, gently touching my cheek, wiping away a stray lock of hair that had fallen across my face during the confrontation. It was the only display of genuine warmth she would offer tonight, and it was reserved exclusively for her daughter. "You are wearing the crimson lipstick," my mother observed, her voice low, steady, and entirely unfazed by the hostile audience surrounding us. "That is a very good sign, Madeline. It means you are finally done apologizing for existing in a space you own." "I am completely done," I confirmed, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my voice matching her calm cadence. "I am ready to go." My mother offered a single approving nod. Then very slowly she turned her head. Her icy gaze swept over the Reynolds family, studying them the way a scientist might study a fascinating but ultimately useless species of insect. She took in Carter's flushed, panicked face. She took in Penelope's cheap borrowed diamonds. And finally, her eyes locked onto Richard Reynolds, the patriarch who had just threatened to throw her only child out into the freezing street. The standoff had officially shifted. The Reynolds family was no longer circling a defenseless prey. They were suddenly trapped in a cage with a tiger, and the heavy iron doors had just firmly locked behind them. Richard Reynolds was a man whose entire worldview was shaped by his own bloated bank account and an archaic class system he desperately clung to. He could not comprehend a reality where my mother, the woman he had spent years painting as a destitute and uneducated tragic figure, could afford the Patek Philippe on her wrist or the Armani suit she wore. His brain aggressively rejected the visual evidence standing right in front of him. He needed to be the most powerful person in the room, and he was willing to make a complete fool of himself to maintain that illusion. Richard broke the stunned silence. He puffed out his chest, adjusted his tailored tuxedo jacket, and marched directly toward Josephine. He stopped mere inches from her, attempting to use his height and physical bulk to intimidate her the exact same way he had always intimidated me. "Well, look who finally decided to crawl out of the woodwork," Richard boomed, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You must be the mother we have heard absolutely nothing about. I suppose I should not be surprised that a gold-digging rat like your daughter would call her mother the second her meal ticket got revoked." He sneered at her custom charcoal suit, clearly assuming it was a cheap knockoff bought specifically for this occasion. He looked at her two massive executive assistants and scoffed, believing they were just hired actors meant to put on a show. "I do not know how you managed to sneak past the front gate of this establishment," Richard continued, pointing a thick, shaking finger toward the heavy glass doors. "But this is a private, highly exclusive event for people of actual status. You and your hysterical daughter have exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out of my sight before I have the police arrest you both for trespassing and attempted extortion." Josephine Sinclair did not flinch. She did not raise her voice to defend her honor. She did not even look at Richard and his pointing finger. She simply stared at him with an expression of profound, almost clinical boredom. She let his empty threats hang in the heavy air, allowing the sheer embarrassment of his unhinged behavior to settle over the hundreds of wealthy guests watching from the ballroom entrance. Without breaking eye contact with the furious patriarch, my mother slowly raised her right hand and snapped her fingers once. It was a sharp, crisp sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent marble foyer. Immediately, the executive assistant standing to her left stepped forward. He did not pull out a weapon or a legal document. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his tailored suit, produced a pristine white silk cloth, and seamlessly retrieved a crystal flute of champagne from a passing, completely terrified waiter who had been frozen nearby. The assistant handed the glass to my mother with a slight, highly respectful bow. My mother took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne. She swirled the golden liquid in the crystal flute, examining the bubbles before finally addressing the man who had just threatened her with federal arrest. "Dom Perignon Vintage 2008? My mother noted, her voice smooth and chillingly calm. "A remarkably expensive choice for a man whose commercial properties are currently facing multiple foreclosure notices, Richard." Richard dropped his pointing hand. His face went completely blank. The aggressive, forward-leaning posture he had adopted instantly collapsed. He blinked rapidly, his mind desperately trying to compute how this supposed trailer park mother possessed classified knowledge of his impending financial doom. Carter, completely oblivious to the massive warning signs flashing in front of him, stepped up beside his father. He was sweating profusely now, his tailored collar suddenly looking far too tight for his panic-stricken body. "Who do you think you are?" Carter demanded, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure of the room. "You cannot just waltz in here and spout absolute nonsense. My father is Richard Reynolds. He practically built the commercial district of this city. You are just a pathetic old woman trying to help her daughter steal my money." Penelope nodded furiously in agreement, clinging desperately to her brother and his delusional confidence. She crossed her arms, trying to look intimidating, but she just looked small and ridiculous. Andre, however, remained entirely silent. His legal instincts were screaming at him. He was staring intensely at my mother, and her face trying to place where he had seen her before. As a senior corporate lawyer, Andre read the financial papers religiously. He recognized the premium Italian leather of the briefcases her assistants carried. He recognized the specific model of the watch on her wrist, a timepiece that cost more than his entire annual salary. The terrifying realization of who was actually standing in front of him was just beginning to claw at the edges of his mind, draining the blood completely from his face. My mother ignored Carter completely. She handed the half-empty crystal flute back to her assistant. She smoothed the lapel of her blazer and took a single step closer to Richard, forcing the towering patriarch to instinctively step backward. My mother did not even acknowledge Richard stepping backward. She completely dismissed him as a physical and social threat, which was the absolute ultimate insult to a man whose entire ego required constant, desperate validation. Instead, she glided right past the sputtering patriarch, bringing herself face to face with my husband. Carter swallowed hard. He tried to maintain his aggressive, broad-shouldered stance, but up close the sheer intimidation of my mother was suffocating. She looked him up and down, her cold eyes lingering on his expensive silk tie and the faint sheen of nervous sweat pooling on his forehead. She was studying him, dismantling his fake confidence piece by piece without even raising her voice. "Are you the boy?" my mother asked. Her voice dropping to a deceptively soft, almost melodic register, who just handed my daughter a cocktail napkin and told her to wipe her tears. Carter shifted his weight nervously. He looked over his shoulder at his father for support, but Richard was still entirely paralyzed by the mention of his highly classified impending foreclosures. Left to defend his own fragile masculinity, Carter chose the only defense mechanism he actually knew: pure, unearned arrogance. "I am a grown man," Carter snapped, puffing out his chest to make himself appear larger in his tailored suit. "I am the vice president of Reynolds Commercial Real Estate, and I am the man who gave your daughter a life of luxury she could never have afforded on her own." My mother tilted her head, a faint, highly amused smile playing on her lips. "A life of luxury," she repeated mildly, as if she were speaking to a delusional toddler. "Yes," Carter barked, his voice growing louder as he tried to convince the watching crowd of his absolute superiority. "She lived in my luxury penthouse. She attended my high society galas. I paid for everything. But tonight she proved exactly what she is: a bitter, ungrateful peasant who cannot handle the reality of high-level business." My mother did not interrupt him. She did not leap to my defense or scream at him for insulting me. She simply watched him rant, allowing the rope to spool out so he could enthusiastically hang himself with it. This was the ultimate cat-and-mouse game, and Carter did not even realize he was the prey. "You think you can walk in here wearing a rented designer suit and intimidate me?" Carter sneered, emboldened by my mother's silence. "I know exactly what kind of people you are. Grifters, con artists. You probably pawned everything you own just to look presentable tonight. But it will not work. My family is entirely untouchable. Tomorrow morning I am sitting down at the largest boardroom table in the financial district to close a $50 million corporate merger. That deal will completely cement the Reynolds legacy for the next century. We are Titan investors. We build skylines. And you and your pathetic daughter are absolutely nothing to us. You are peasant trash." The lobby was dead silent. The hundreds of guests watching from the ballroom entrance were hanging on to every single word. Penelope had a smug, self-satisfied smirk on her face, completely buying into her brother's bluster. Even Richard seemed to recover slightly, his chest puffing out again at the loud mention of the massive buyout that was supposed to save them from total ruin. But out of the corner of my eye I saw Andre. The hotshot corporate lawyer had finally connected the dots. I watched Andre's hands begin to tremble violently. He tried to reach out to grab Carter's sleeve to physically stop him from speaking, but he was far too late. My mother let Carter finish his ridiculous speech. She let the echo of his arrogant boasting fade into the cold marble walls. Then the faint amused smile on her lips blossomed into a terrifying, predatory grin. It was the exact smile that made seasoned Wall Street bankers break out in cold sweats before they lost everything. "A $50 million corporate merger," my mother mused, her voice echoing clearly across the silent room. She turned slightly to her left, exchanging a brief knowing glance with her executive assistant. That is quite an impressive milestone for a boy who lost his entire trust fund on a bankrupt strip mall 3 years ago. Carter flinched as if he had been physically struck. The smug smirk vanished instantly from Penelope's face. My mother took another slow, deliberate step forward, forcing Carter to look directly into her icy blue eyes. Let me make sure I have the details of this monumental business transaction entirely correct, my mother said, her tone dripping with lethal precision. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, your struggling real estate firm is scheduled to be acquired in a comprehensive bailout. A merger designed to save your family from total financial collapse. Carter stared at her, his jaw tightly clenched, a fresh bead of sweat rolling down his temple. He did not answer, but his terrified silence was confirmation enough. And this life-saving acquisition, my mother continued, her voice slicing through the tension, like a sharpened scalpel, is being orchestrated by a highly aggressive private equity firm based in Manhattan. A firm known as Sinclair Holdings. Correct. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He stood frozen under the blinding chandeliers, his face a terrifying shade of pale gray, resembling a fish gasping for air on dry land. The arrogant vice president, who had just commanded security to throw his wife onto the street, was now completely paralyzed by the mention of the very firm that held his financial life in its hands. This was the exact moment Andre decided to make the worst miscalculation of his entire professional career. As a highly paid African-American corporate lawyer who had fought tooth and nail to secure a senior partnership at a prestigious downtown firm, Andre usually possessed impeccable instincts. But his desperate, pathetic need to constantly prove his worth to his wealthy father-in-law completely blinded him to the massive danger standing right in front of him. He saw Carter faltering. He saw Richard speechless. He saw a golden opportunity to step up as the brilliant legal savior of the Reynolds family empire. Andre smoothly stepped in front of Carter, physically placing himself between my terrified husband and my mother. He aggressively adjusted the crisp cuffs of his bespoke suit, puffed out his chest, and fully deployed his most intimidating courtroom voice. "I'm going to stop you right there," Andre announced, his deep voice carrying an undeniable air of practiced authority. "I do not know how you managed to discover the confidential details of our pending corporate merger, but coming into a private venue to flaunt illegally obtained financial information is a catastrophic mistake." My mother did not step back. She simply shifted her icy gaze from Carter to Andre, examining him from the top of his perfectly groomed head down to his expensive leather shoes. "Are you supposed to be the family attack dog?" my mother asked softly, her tone laced with mild amusement. "Or just the court jester?" Penelope gasped loudly from the sidelines, outraged on behalf of her husband. "I am the lead corporate counsel for Reynolds Commercial Real Estate," Andre fired back, his jaw clenching in anger. "I am also a senior partner at one of the most ruthless litigation firms in this state. And as of this exact moment, you are legally trespassing on a closed private event. You are publicly harassing my clients, and by loudly discussing a highly classified $50 million corporate acquisition in a room full of outside investors, you are actively committing tortious interference with a prospective business advantage." Andre took a step closer, attempting to use his height to tower over her. He pointed a firm, authoritative finger toward the heavy glass doors of the lobby. The hundreds of guests watching from the ballroom entrance were completely silent, hanging onto every single word of the legal showdown. "If you do not turn around and walk out of those doors immediately," Andre threatened, his voice dropping into a menacing register, "I will personally draft the civil lawsuit tomorrow morning. I will bury you in so much litigation you will spend the rest of your pathetic life paying off my legal fees. I will have you federally investigated for corporate espionage. You are entirely out of your depth, lady." The Reynolds family visibly relaxed. Richard let out a heavy breath, clearly relieved that his son-in-law had stepped up to handle the situation with aggressive legal force. Carter wiped the sweat from his forehead, a faint, shaky smirk returning to his face. They actually believed Andre had just won the battle. They believed his fancy legal jargon and deep voice had successfully neutralized the threat. My mother looked at Andre's pointing finger. Then she looked up into his angry, confident eyes. She did not look angry. She did not look intimidated. She looked at him with sheer, unadulterated pity. It was the exact look you give a small child who proudly presents a drawing that is completely unrecognizable. Without saying a single word, my mother raised her crystal flute and took another slow, elegant sip of her vintage champagne. She swallowed, handed the glass back to her assistant, and offered Andre a smile so cold it could have frozen the entire room. "A senior partner," my mother repeated softly, shaking her head in genuine disappointment. It is truly staggering how low the standards have fallen at corporate law firms these days. You stand there loudly quoting tortious interference and corporate espionage, yet you completely failed to perform the most basic due diligence on the very acquisition that is supposedly saving your father-in-law from total bankruptcy. Andre stiffened, his confident posture wavering just a fraction of an inch. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, though the absolute certainty in his voice was suddenly gone. "I am talking about the fact that you are fiercely protecting a sinking ship while completely ignoring the torpedo heading straight for the hull," my mother replied, her voice slicing through the heavy air. "You threatened to bury me in litigation, counselor, but you have absolutely no idea who you are actually threatening to sue." Without breaking her gaze from Andre, my mother gave a single, barely perceptible nod to the executive assistant standing at her right. The assistant stepped forward with military precision. He reached into the inner pocket of his impeccably tailored suit jacket and withdrew a sleek silver card holder. With a swift, practiced motion, he slid out a single business card and extended it toward Andre. It was not a standard flimsy piece of white paper covered in flashy gold foil. True power never needs to shout. The card was crafted from thick, matte black cardstock. It was heavy, minimalist, and deeply intimidating. The text on it was engraved in simple, understated silver lettering. Andre stared at the extended hand for a long moment. His chest was still puffed out, his jaw still set in a mask of aggressive legal confidence. He snatched the card from the assistant's fingers, fully intending to glance at it, scoff, and throw it onto the marble floor to prove his absolute dominance. But the moment his eyes focused on the crisp silver text, his arrogant lawyer persona completely shattered. I watched the transformation happen in real time, and it was the most spectacular display of instant karma I had ever witnessed. It started with his eyes. They widened so drastically, I thought they might actually pop out of his skull. Then the confident flush of anger vanished from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly, chalky pallor. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked as though he were about to faint right there in the country club lobby. "Andre," Penelope demanded, her voice shrill and dripping with irritation. She had noticed her husband's sudden, terrifying silence. "What does the card say? Just rip it up and let the security guards throw them out." Andre did not rip it up. He could not even move his hands. His fingers began to tremble violently, the heavy black cardstock vibrating visibly in his grip. His knees, which just seconds ago had been locked in a stance of aggressive authority, began to shake. He actually had to shift his weight backward to keep himself from completely collapsing under the crushing weight of his own monumental stupidity. As a senior corporate partner, Andre knew exactly how the financial food chain worked. He knew that the Reynolds family firm, despite all their arrogant boasting, was a tiny, struggling minnow drowning in an ocean of bad debt. And he knew that the firm positioned to acquire them was a massive, bloodthirsty great white shark. He had just spent the last 5 minutes screaming at, threatening, and insulting the apex predator of that entire ocean. Andre Carter barked, stepping forward and aggressively grabbing his brother-in-law by the shoulder. Carter was starting to panic, infected by the sheer terror radiating from Andre. "What is going on? Who are these people?" Andre slowly lifted his head. He looked at Carter, then looked past him to Richard. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He swallowed heavily, his Adam's apple bobbing in a desperate attempt to find his voice. When he finally spoke, his deep, booming courtroom voice was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a hollow, terrified whisper. "It is her," Andre stammered, his eyes darting frantically between the Reynolds patriarch and the matte black card in his trembling hand. "Speak up!" Richard roared, his patience completely exhausted. He marched forward, his face flushed with renewed anger. "Who is she?" Andre slowly turned the card around, holding it up with a violently shaking hand, so the entire Reynolds family could see the understated silver lettering. "She is Josephine Sinclair." Andre choked out, his voice cracking on the syllables. He looked at Richard with eyes full of absolute unadulterated horror. "She is the founder and chief executive officer of Sinclair Holdings. She is the chairwoman of the private equity board. She is the buyer, Richard. She is the one funding the $50 million bailout tomorrow morning." The words hung in the air, echoing off the high marble ceilings of the country club. The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was a suffocating, paralyzing vacuum. It was the sound of an entire delusional empire crashing violently to the ground. Penelope gasped, both of her hands flying up to cover her mouth as she stumbled backward on her designer heels. She looked at my mother as if she were staring at a ghost. Carter let go of Andre's shoulder as if he had just touched a burning stove. He stumbled back, his eyes frantically darting between the business card, my mother, and finally settling on me. The devastating reality of the situation was violently crashing through his thick skull. He finally realized why I was completely unfazed by his financial threats. He finally understood why I had laughed when he threatened to lock me out of the penthouse. He had spent 5 entire years treating me like a disposable peasant. He had allowed his family to publicly humiliate me, isolate me, and force me to shrink myself to protect his fragile ego. And all this time, he had been sleeping next to the sole heir of the very financial empire he was currently begging for a bailout. "You," Carter whispered, his voice trembling as he stared at me, the arrogance completely stripped from his soul. "Your name, your maiden name is Sinclair." "Yes, Carter," I replied, my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of any warmth. "Madeline Sinclair. Not the charity case you bragged about saving to all of your country club friends. Not the destitute peasant who desperately needed your financial rescue. I am the sole heir of the woman standing right in front of you. The woman who quite literally owns the air your failing company breathes." The silence that fell over the Oak Ridge Country Club was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on the massive marble foyer. Behind us, the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom were still propped wide open. 400 of the most influential politicians, wealthy investors, and elite socialites in the city were crowded near the entrance, peering out into the lobby. These were the exact people Richard and Carter had spent decades desperately trying to impress with their fake wealth. Now they were all standing dead silent, watching the Reynolds family legacy publicly disintegrate in real time. I could see prominent bank executives whispering urgently to each other, already pulling out their phones to cancel tomorrow morning's meetings. The only sound in the entire building was the faint clinking of melting ice in the abandoned cocktail glasses. Carter looked frantically between me and my mother. For 5 years, he had been entirely blind to the obvious. Now, staring at us side by side under the bright chandelier light, the undeniable physical resemblance finally hit him like a concrete block. We had the exact same sharp jawline. We possessed the same icy blue eyes. We carried ourselves with the exact same unbreakable posture. He had lived with me for half a decade, and never once bothered to look closely enough to see the Titan standing right in his own living room. But why? Carter stuttered, his voice sounding small and pathetic as his broad shoulders slumped forward. "Why would you hide it? Why would you pretend to be nobody?" "I did not pretend to be nobody," I corrected him, taking one slow, deliberate step forward, so he had to look me directly in the eyes. "I simply dropped the Sinclair attachment from my name when I moved to this city. I wanted to build a life based on my own genuine talent. I wanted to know what it felt like to be loved and respected for who I actually am, not for the billions of dollars sitting quietly in my family trust fund. I wanted a real partner, Carter. I wanted an equal. I paused, letting my eyes sweep over his terrified, sweating face. The man I had spent 5 years serving suddenly looked incredibly small. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, satisfying closure. I actually believed you were a good man beneath all the arrogant, toxic bluster your father constantly forced down your throat. I continued, my voice echoing clearly for the 400 guests to hear. I thought my devotion could make you better. But I was completely wrong. My sacrifice was entirely wasted on a family of parasites. You do not know how to love. You only know how to consume, exploit, and destroy to make yourselves feel important. Richard finally found his voice, though the booming, terrifying patriarch tone was completely gone. It was replaced by the desperate, shaky wheeze of a cornered animal. Now, Madeline, let us not be hasty, Richard pleaded, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. We are family. Family members sometimes say things they do not mean in the heat of the moment. We can simply go back inside the ballroom, sit down, and discuss this pending merger like civilized adults. I looked at Richard with pure, unfiltered disgust. 10 minutes ago, he was commanding his security guards to throw me onto the freezing street without a coat. Now that he realized I held the keys to his literal financial survival, he was suddenly eager to play the loving father-in-law. It was sickeningly predictable. Civilized adults do not hand their wives a napkin and tell them to wipe their tears while a ballroom full of strangers laughs at them. I fired back, my words slicing mercilessly through Richard's pathetic attempt at diplomacy. Civilized adults do not threaten to blacklist an honest business just to feed their own massive, fragile egos. Penelope, still completely unable to process the total destruction of her fake high society reality, grabbed her husband's arm. Andre, do something. Penelope hissed frantically, her acrylic nails digging into his bespoke suit. She is lying. This has to be a trick. She probably hired these actors to scare us. Tell them you are going to sue them right now. Andre violently yanked his arm out of his wife's grasp. He glared at Penelope with a look of absolute unmasked hatred. Shut your mouth, Penelope. Andre hissed through clenched teeth, his professional survival instincts fully overriding his marriage vows. Are you completely insane? That is Josephine Sinclair. If you say one more word, she will ensure neither of us ever works in this state again. Just shut up. Penelope physically recoiled, tears of genuine panic finally spilling over her cheeks. Her own husband had just publicly turned on her to save his own skin. The toxic Reynolds family dynamic was already beginning to completely cannibalize itself. My mother watched their pathetic display with cold, clinical detachment. She had given them enough time to fully digest the shockwave. Now it was time to drop the guillotine. My mother turned her attention away from Penelope and Andre. She had no interest in watching a toxic marriage tear itself apart. She had a much larger target to execute. With slow, measured steps, she walked over to the antique mahogany console table where Richard had aggressively slammed the post-nuptial agreement just minutes earlier. She looked down at the legally binding document my husband had tried to force me to sign, then gave another subtle nod to the executive assistant standing by her side. The assistant immediately stepped forward. He placed his heavy Italian leather briefcase directly on top of the mahogany table, completely covering Andre's ridiculous legal contract. The sharp metallic click of the combination locks echoing in the quiet lobby sounded exactly like the cocking of a loaded weapon. The assistant flipped the lid open, reached inside and pulled out a massive, intimidating stack of thick financial dossiers bound in bright red folders. With a loud, heavy thud, he dropped the entire stack onto the polished wood. These, my mother announced, her voice, projecting clearly so that every single guest standing at the ballroom entrance could hear her, are the comprehensive risk assessment files my acquisitions team has meticulously compiled on Reynolds commercial real estate over the past 3 weeks. Richard took a shaky step forward, his eyes glued to the red folders. You cannot bring private corporate documents into a public space, he croaked, his voice entirely devoid of its usual booming authority. That is highly confidential financial data. Confidential, my mother repeated, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. You stood in this lobby 5 minutes ago and loudly threatened to blacklist my daughter's business across the entire East Coast. You thought public humiliation was a highly effective weapon, Richard. Now you are about to find out exactly how it feels when that weapon is pointed back at you. She placed her perfectly manicured hand flat against the top folder. My analysts spent weeks digging through the absolute garbage fire you call a corporate portfolio. She stated, her tone cold and surgical. We found the heavily inflated property valuations. We found the 3 hidden shell companies you created specifically to mask your bleeding cash flow. We even found the severe delinquency notices on your downtown plaza development. Your entire real estate empire is nothing but a masterclass in accounting fraud and desperate smoke and mirrors. The crowd of 400 guests erupted into a loud, frantic wave of overlapping whispers. I saw a prominent city councilman who had backed one of Richard's recent projects immediately pull out his phone and walk away from the crowd, making an urgent call. The public facade of the Reynolds family was completely disintegrating before their very eyes. Carter looked as though he were going to be violently ill. He gripped the edge of a nearby marble pillar just to keep himself standing. He was finally grasping the magnitude of his mistake. We signed a letter of intent, Richard shouted desperately, trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of control he had left. His face was slick with cold sweat. You cannot just walk away from this. We have a scheduled signing tomorrow morning. We have lawyers. Andre, tell her she cannot do this. Andre did not move a single muscle. He stared at the floor, completely refusing to make eye contact with his father-in-law. As a corporate lawyer, Andre knew exactly what my mother was about to say. A letter of intent is a preliminary courtesy, Richard, my mother corrected him, her voice slicing through his panic like a steel blade. It is not a legally binding contract. It is entirely contingent upon a final financial review. And having reviewed these absolutely pathetic numbers, I have made my final executive decision. My mother picked up the top red folder, held it in the air for a brief moment, and then let it drop back onto the table with a loud slap. The $50 million bailout acquisition scheduled for tomorrow morning is officially and permanently cancelled. My mother declared, her words falling like heavy blows from a gavel. Sinclair Holdings is completely withdrawing its offer. We will not be acquiring your firm. We will not be absorbing your massive liabilities. We will not be saving your family legacy. You are entirely on your own. Richard physically stumbled backward. He brought a shaking hand to his chest, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. The bailout was his absolute last lifeline. It was the only thing standing between his arrogant country club lifestyle and total financial ruin. By killing the deal, my mother had just signed his corporate death warrant in front of 400 people. But as devastating as the cancelled acquisition was, the execution was not over yet. My mother had one final catastrophic card left to play, and it was about to wipe them off the map entirely. My mother did not even let the gasps from the crowd fully subside before she raised her hand again. Her executive assistant immediately reached back into the leather briefcase. This time, he did not pull out a thick red dossier. He pulled out a single, incredibly thin manila folder. He placed it gently on the mahogany table, right next to the mountain of financial ruin he had just unloaded. My mother rested her fingertips on the edge of the thin folder. Canceling the acquisition only stops your future, Richard, she said, her voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that forced the entire lobby to lean in to hear her. But I am a thorough woman. I do not just cut off the life support. I dismantle the hospital. Richard stared at the thin folder, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. What is that? He wheezed, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization that the worst was somehow still to come. 6 months ago, my mother explained smoothly, when your ridiculous son decided to propose a merger to save your sinking ship, I took a very close look at your primary lenders. It turns out the National Bank holding the mortgage on your downtown commercial plaza was incredibly eager to offload your toxic debt. You were 3 payments behind. You were a massive liability on their quarterly reports. So I did them a favor. She slowly opened the manila folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the official seal of the State Financial Regulatory Commission. Sinclair Holdings quietly purchased your $30 million commercial debt. My mother announced, her words hitting the marble lobby like a series of rhythmic physical blows. We bought it for absolute pennies on the dollar through a blind proxy corporation. We did not just review your financials, Richard. We currently own them. I am your primary creditor. I hold the deed to your office building. I hold the lien on your son's luxury penthouse. I hold the absolute entirety of your pathetic fake empire in the palm of my hand. Carter let out a strangled, pathetic noise from the back of his throat. He looked at me, his eyes wide with desperate panic, realizing that the very woman he had just threatened to lock out of her own home was actually the person who owned the physical doors. But Andre was the one who reacted the most violently. The hotshot corporate lawyer suddenly grabbed his own head, his fingers digging into his scalp as he stared at the document on the table. "Wait," Andre gasped, his voice cracking loudly. "The debt transfer. I reviewed that transfer 6 months ago. It was a standard corporate reassignment. The terms of the loan were locked. You cannot just alter the repayment schedule without cause. The loan does not mature for another 5 years. My mother turned her piercing gaze toward Andre. She smiled again, and it was the most terrifying expression I had ever seen. "You are absolutely right, counselor," my mother agreed cheerfully. "The repayment schedule was locked. Unless, of course, the debtor violates the standard covenants buried deep within the master agreement. I am assuming you thoroughly read the updated contract when the debt was transferred to my holding company." Andre stood frozen, his eyes darting frantically as he mentally scanned the hundreds of pages of legal boilerplate he had undoubtedly skimmed through 6 months prior. "Let me refresh your memory," my mother offered generously. Section 4. Paragraph B. The Moral Turpitude and Public Disparagement Clause. It is a very standard addition I require on all of my high-yield debt acquisitions. It clearly states that if the debtor or any member of the debtor's immediate family engages in public behavior that severely damages the reputation, dignity, or public standing of the creditor or the creditor's immediate family, the loan enters immediate default. The realization hit Andre with the force of a freight train. He stumbled backward, bumping hard into the marble pillar behind him. "You just spent the last 20 minutes standing in a highly populated country club lobby," my mother continued, raising her voice so it echoed clearly into the packed ballroom. "You publicly harassed, threatened, and verbally abused my only daughter. You commanded security guards to physically assault the sole heir to Sinclair Holdings in front of 400 prominent investors. That is not just a breach of basic human decency. That is a textbook, legally undeniable violation of the Moral Turpitude Clause." She looked back at Richard, who was now swaying slightly on his feet, his face drained of all color. "As the primary creditor," my mother declared, her voice ringing out with absolute final authority, "I am officially triggering the default clause. The entire $30 million balance is due immediately. You have exactly 48 hours to wire the funds to my holding company, or I will seize every single asset tied to your name. I will take your company. I will take your homes. I will take the cars out of your driveways." Richard tried to speak, but no words came out. His face turned a terrifying mottled shade of purple. He raised a shaking hand, desperately clawing at the collar of his tailored tuxedo shirt, as if invisible hands were choking him. A sharp, guttural gasp escaped his lips. He clutched his chest tightly, his knees finally buckling under the crushing weight of his complete destruction. He collapsed backward, falling heavily into a plush velvet lobby chair, his eyes rolling back in sheer, unadulterated panic. As Richard's heavy frame hit the velvet chair, a fresh wave of gasps erupted from the ballroom entrance. Carter scrambled to his father's side, frantically loosening the patriarch's tailored silk tie and patting his chest. But nobody yelled for a doctor. Nobody called an ambulance. It was glaringly obvious to every single wealthy investor watching from the doorway that Richard was not suffering from a fatal cardiac event. He was suffering from the crushing, paralyzing realization that his financial life was entirely over. The arrogant titan of commercial real estate had just been publicly reduced to a bankrupt, humiliated debtor. While Carter hovered over his hyperventilating father, Penelope was left standing completely alone in the center of the lobby. She was frozen in place, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. The high society facade she had worn like an impenetrable suit of armor for her entire life was violently shattering into a million pieces. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, desperately seeking a lifeline, and landed on her husband. Andre had already physically distanced himself from the family. He had retreated to the far corner of the foyer, his back turned to his wife, frantically typing on his phone. He was undoubtedly messaging his law firm partners, desperate to sever his professional ties to the toxic Reynolds name, before the financial contagion completely ruined his own career. He was abandoning the sinking ship, and he was leaving Penelope to drown. The devastating reality of her situation finally hit Penelope with the force of a runaway freight train. She did not have a trust fund to fall back on. The luxury sports car she drove was leased under the company name. Her massive suburban house, her designer wardrobe, her exclusive country club membership, and the very diamond tennis bracelet sparkling on her wrist tonight were all funded by the highly leveraged commercial properties my mother had just forcefully seized. Without the Reynolds Company credit cards, Penelope had absolutely nothing. She was completely, utterly ruined. Penelope slowly turned her head and locked eyes with me. The cruel, mocking sneer that had permanently lived on her perfectly contoured face for the past 5 years vanished in an instant. Her lower lip began to tremble violently. Heavy, dark tears of pure panic spilled over her thick eyelashes, carrying streaks of expensive mascara down her pale cheeks. She took a shaky, stumbling step toward me, her hands outstretched in a pathetic, desperate gesture of surrender. "Maddie, please!" Penelope choked out her voice, cracking into a high-pitched, agonizing whine that echoed off the marble walls. "Please, you have to stop this. You cannot let your mother do this to us." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer, shameless audacity of her pivot. Less than 15 minutes ago, she had been standing in this exact spot, aggressively pointing an acrylic nail in my face. She had called me a psychotic gold digger. She had laughed with absolute malicious delight at the prospect of security guards throwing me out into the freezing winter night with nothing but the dress on my back. Now her arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the terrified weeping of a spoiled child who had just broken her favorite toy. "We are family," Penelope sobbed loudly, taking another stumbling step forward and desperately reaching out to grab my arm. I immediately took a sharp step backward, completely refusing to let her hands touch me. "You are my sister, Maddie. You know we love you. Carter loves you so much. My dad was just stressed about the massive corporate merger. We did not mean any of those horrible things we said. We were just joking around. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Talk to Josephine. Tell her to reinstate the bailout. Tell her to tear up the default notice. We will lose our homes. We will lose everything." I looked down at her tear-stained, blotchy face, feeling absolutely nothing but a deep, profound sense of icy closure. "Sister?" I repeated softly, testing the word on my tongue as if it were a foreign language. "You never called me your sister when you intentionally left me off the family vacation itineraries. You never called me your sister when you mocked my clothes at Sunday dinners. You never called me your sister when you cheered for your husband to serve me with a post-nuptial agreement. You only see me as family right now, because I am the only person standing between you and absolute crushing poverty." Penelope let out a loud, ugly gasp, dropping her face into her shaking hands as she sobbed uncontrollably. I completely ignored her tears. I turned away from her and walked purposefully over to the antique mahogany console table. Sitting right next to my mother's stack of devastating financial dossiers was the thick legal document Andre had ambushed me with earlier in the evening. The post-nuptial asset protection agreement. The binding contract deliberately designed to completely strip me of any financial rights to the Reynolds empire. I picked up the heavy stack of paper. The black binding clip had already been removed by Richard when he threw his gold pen down. I turned back to face Penelope, who was watching me through her tears with wide, desperately hopeful eyes. She actually believed my movement meant I was considering her pathetic plea. I held the contract up high under the bright chandelier light so she could clearly see the bold black lettering printed on the front page. Your husband brought this document to protect your massive family empire from me, Penelope? I said, my voice projecting coldly and clearly across the polished marble floor. But as you just found out, you do not have an empire to protect anymore. You just have a mountain of toxic debt. I gripped the top edge of the thick legal document with both of my hands. With one sharp, incredibly forceful motion, I ripped the entire stack of paper cleanly down the middle. The loud, satisfying sound of tearing paper ripped through the quiet lobby. I took one final step forward, holding the two shredded halves of the contract directly over Penelope's trembling feet. I opened my hands. The torn, useless pages fluttered through the air like heavy winter snow, landing in a messy, chaotic heap directly on top of her designer shoes. The shredded pieces of the post-nuptial agreement settled over Penelope's designer shoes like the ashes of her completely destroyed reality. I did not waste another second looking at her. I slowly turned my attention to the very center of the lobby where my husband was currently undergoing a spectacular, catastrophic mental collapse. Carter was the last one left standing, but his legs were visibly shaking. He looked at his father, who was still gasping for air and clutching his chest in the velvet chair. He looked at his sister, who was sobbing uncontrollably at my feet. He looked at his lawyer brother-in-law, who was completely ignoring the family and frantically typing on his phone in the far corner. The absolute realization that his entire empire was gone, his money was gone, and his protective shield of arrogance had been entirely stripped away, finally broke him. His knees buckled. With a loud echoing thud that reverberated across the polished marble floor, Carter dropped heavily to his knees, the vice president of Reynolds Commercial Real Estate, the man who just 20 minutes ago had commanded a room of 400 elite guests and demanded I be thrown onto the freezing street, was now kneeling at my feet. The arrogant posture was completely gone. His expensive tailored tuxedo jacket hung loosely on his slumping shoulders. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled and damp with nervous sweat. He looked up at me, and for the first time in 5 years, I saw genuine, unadulterated terror in his eyes. Maddie Carter whimpered, his voice cracking violently. Heavy, thick tears began to well up in his eyes and spill rapidly down his flushed cheeks. Please, Maddie, you cannot leave me like this. You are my wife. We took vows. You are my soulmate. I stared down at him, feeling a deep wave of pure disgust wash over me. A narcissist will always play the victim the absolute second they lose control of the narrative. Do not dare talk to me about wedding vows, Carter, I said, my voice ice cold and completely devoid of any sympathy. You broke every single vow the moment you allowed your father to publicly humiliate me, and then joined in on the laughter. Carter shook his head frantically, the tears flying from his face and hitting the marble floor. It was not me! Carter sobbed, his voice echoing pathetically in the silent country club. He raised a shaking hand and pointed a desperate finger at his father, who was still slumped in the chair. It was him, Maddie. Richard forced me to do it. He pressured me all week. He told me that if I did not make you sign that legal agreement tonight, he would fire me from the firm. He threatened to cut me completely out of the family will. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you. I have always loved you. I was just terrified of him. I looked at the 35-year-old man kneeling on the floor, weeping loudly and blaming his elderly father for his own malicious actions. He was a coward to his very core. He was perfectly happy to ride the wave of his family's toxic abuse when he thought it made him look powerful. And the second the tables turned, he was ready to throw his own flesh and blood directly under the bus to save his own skin. He reached out with both hands, desperately trying to grab the silk hem of my evening gown. I took a sharp, immediate step backward, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. Do not touch me, I commanded, my voice slicing through his pathetic sobbing like a whip. You do not love me, Carter. You love the $80,000 security deposit I paid for your penthouse. You love having a quiet, obedient prop to stand next to you at your ridiculous high society galas. You love the illusion of superiority, but you have absolutely nothing left to be superior about. Carter let out a loud, ugly wail. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving as he sobbed openly in front of the hundreds of wealthy investors and politicians who were still watching in stunned silence from the ballroom entrance. The ultimate public humiliation he had tried to inflict on me had completely rebounded, crushing him under its immense weight. I calmly opened the silver clasp of my evening clutch. I reached inside and retrieved a small, crumpled square of white linen. It was the exact same cocktail napkin Carter had aggressively shoved against my chest 30 minutes ago. I had quietly scooped it off the ballroom floor on my way to the restroom, knowing instinctively that I would need a physical reminder to stop me from ever looking back. I stepped forward, looking down at the weeping, broken man I used to call my husband. I held the crumpled linen napkin out over his bowed head and slowly opened my fingers. The white fabric fluttered through the air and landed softly right on top of his messy hair. Carter froze, looking up at the napkin as it slid down and landed in his trembling lap. "Wipe your tears, Carter," I said, staring directly into his terrified, swollen eyes. "And go bankrupt properly." Carter did not move to brush the napkin away. He stayed frozen on his knees on the cold marble floor, his hands trembling in his lap. The white linen square rested on his perfectly styled hair like a pathetic flag of surrender. The loud, racking sobs tearing through his chest were the only sounds left in his entire hollow existence. I looked down at him for one final second, committing the image of his absolute defeat to memory, and then I simply turned my back. I walked over to where my mother was standing. She had watched the entire exchange with the quiet, dignified approval of a seasoned general witnessing a flawless victory on the battlefield. I stopped beside her, taking a deep breath of the lobby air. For the first time in 5 years, my lungs felt completely clear. The suffocating pressure of constantly measuring my words, hiding my achievements, and bowing to their ridiculous demands was entirely gone. I felt incredibly light. My mother gave me a single affirming nod. Then she signaled her 2 executive assistants. They moved with the exact same synchronized precision they had displayed upon entering. The assistant on the right carefully gathered the thick red financial dossiers and the single devastating manila folder. He stacked them neatly, placed them back inside the premium Italian leather briefcase, and snapped the heavy metal locks shut. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like a final judge's gavel slamming down on the Reynolds family legacy. "It is time to go, Madeline," my mother said, her voice calm and authoritative. "The air in here has become remarkably stale." Without sparing another glance at the weeping man on the floor, the hyperventilating patriarch in the chair, or the sobbing sister-in-law, we began our exit. We walked side by side, our heels clicking in perfect unison against the polished marble floor. We headed straight for the heavy glass doors of the country club entrance. The crowd of 400 wealthy investors and socialites who had previously laughed at my expense now moved frantically out of our way. They parted like the Red Sea, pressing themselves flat against the walls and the mahogany pillars to ensure they did not accidentally brush against us. Women who had sneered at my dress earlier now averted their eyes, terrified of drawing my mother's attention. Men who had clapped for Richard's toast were already rapidly calculating how much money they would lose when the Reynolds Company officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the morning. Nobody made a single sound. Nobody dared to offer Richard assistance. In the ruthless world of high society, finance weakness was highly contagious, and the Reynolds family had just been exposed as the ultimate plague. As we approached the exit, Jenkins and his massive security partners scrambled to pull the heavy glass doors open for us, bowing their heads submissively. They had completely abandoned their loyalty to Carter. We stepped over the brass threshold and out into the crisp, freezing winter night. The cold air hit my face immediately, washing away the heavy scent of expensive perfume and stale whiskey that had permeated the ballroom. Waiting directly at the bottom of the grand stone steps was a sleek midnight black Maybach. The engine was already running with a quiet, powerful hum. A uniformed driver stood at attention by the rear passenger side, holding the door wide open for us. But right before we reached the bottom of the steps, the heavy glass doors of the lobby slowly began to swing shut behind us. In that brief fading gap between the luxury of the outside world and the ruins of the foyer, the absolute chaos finally erupted. The Reynolds family had held their breath as long as my mother was in the room, terrified of triggering further retaliation. The second we crossed the threshold, the fragile, toxic glue of their fake wealth instantly dissolved. Andre was the first to attack. His deep, booming courtroom voice ripped through the lobby, but it was no longer aimed at me. He was screaming at Richard and Carter with unhinged, violent fury. "You completely lied to me!" Andre roared, his voice cracking with rage. "You told me the financials were secure. You leveraged my professional name on those loan documents, Richard. I will personally drag you in front of the Federal Ethics Board before I let you take my legal career down with you. I am filing a massive lawsuit against this entire firm tomorrow morning." Penelope shrieked hysterically, demanding that Andre stop yelling at her dying father. Carter suddenly jumped up from the floor, abandoning his tears to scream back at his brother-in-law, aggressively defending his own shattered ego. They were instantly at each other's throats. The men were cursing loudly, blaming one another for the failed bailout and the hidden debt. The mask of high society elegance was completely ripped away, revealing the ugly, greedy, self-serving monsters they truly were. They were actively cannibalizing each other the exact second the money disappeared. I paused for a fraction of a second on the stone steps, listening to the vicious shouting match echoing from inside the building. I did not feel an ounce of pity. They were finally experiencing the exact same toxic abuse they had inflicted on me for half a decade, but this time they were inflicting it on themselves. The heavy glass doors finally clicked shut, completely sealing off the pathetic screaming. I walked down the remaining steps and slid into the warm, luxurious leather interior of the Maybach. My mother slid in right beside me. The driver firmly closed the heavy car door, plunging the cabin into a serene, insulated silence. I sank back against the plush seat, letting out a long, slow breath. The vehicle smoothly accelerated, gliding down the manicured driveway and pulling away from the Oak Ridge Country Club forever. I looked over at my mother, who was already calmly reviewing a new financial document on her tablet, completely unfazed by the empire she had just dismantled. We had won. The Reynolds family was entirely in our rearview mirror, and for the first time in 5 years, I was driving toward a future that actually belonged to me. Exactly 7 days after the catastrophic anniversary party at the Oak Ridge Country Club, my life had settled into a profound and beautiful quiet. I was standing in the center of my downtown art restoration studio, wearing a pair of worn denim overalls covered in faint smudges of oil paint. The afternoon sun was streaming through the massive skylights, illuminating the intricate brushstrokes of a 19th-century portrait I was currently repairing. There were no country club galas to attend. There were no arrogant relatives to serve. There was only the smell of linseed oil, the soft hum of classical music playing from a small speaker, and the absolute peace of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own identity. My mother had moved with the terrifying speed and efficiency that made her a Wall Street legend. Within 48 hours of the anniversary party, Sinclair Holdings had officially seized the commercial properties tied to the Reynolds real estate firm. The luxury penthouse I had shared with Carter was promptly locked down by the bank, forcing him to scramble for a place to sleep. My mother had also dispatched a private security detail to ensure my personal safety, a precaution I initially thought was entirely unnecessary until I looked out the front window of my studio that Tuesday afternoon. Through the frosted glass of my studio storefront, I saw a man pacing frantically on the sidewalk. It was Carter. But he looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant vice president who had screamed at me in front of 400 elite guests just 1 week prior. The physical transformation was entirely pathetic. His expensive tailored tuxedo was gone, replaced by a wrinkled button-down shirt that looked as though it had been slept in for 3 consecutive days. His perfectly styled hair was a greasy, disheveled mess. He was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself, his shoulders hunched in absolute defeat. Clutched tightly in his right hand was a small, wilted bouquet of cheap grocery store flowers wrapped in crinkling clear plastic. The bright orange price tag reading $5.99 was still prominently stuck to the side of the wrapper. He was a broken, desperate man attempting to crawl back to the woman he had treated like garbage, armed with nothing but cheap carnations and empty apologies. Carter finally stopped pacing, took a deep breath, and marched toward the front door of my studio. He reached out to grab the brass handle, entirely expecting to barge right in and manipulate me with a theatrical display of tears. Before his fingers could even touch the brass, two massive security guards stepped out from the recessed entryway, completely blocking his path. These were not the easily intimidated country club guards he was used to bossing around. These were elite, highly trained private contractors hired directly by Sinclair Holdings. They wore plain black suits and mirrored sunglasses, standing side by side to form an impenetrable wall of solid muscle. Carter physically recoiled, dropping his arm to his side. He opened his mouth to shout his usual entitled demands, but the sheer physical intimidation of the two men silenced him instantly. He tried to peek around their massive shoulders, pressing his face close to the glass window to try and catch a glimpse of me inside. Maddie, Carter yelled, his voice muffled through the thick, reinforced glass. "Maddie, please let me in. I just want to talk to you. I have lost everything. The company is completely gone. I need my wife." I stood quietly near my workbench, holding a delicate sable paintbrush. I did not move toward the door. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for his pathetic display. I simply watched him flail against the consequences of his own toxic actions. As Carter continued to beg the unmoving security guards for access, a third man stepped smoothly out of an unmarked black sedan parked discreetly along the curb. He was dressed in a sharp gray suit and carried a thick manila envelope. He walked briskly up the sidewalk, approaching Carter from directly behind. "Carter Reynolds?" the man asked, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Carter spun around, his eyes wide and panicked. "Yes," he answered instinctively, his voice shaking. The man stepped forward and firmly pressed the heavy manila envelope directly against Carter's chest, forcing him to take it. "You have been officially served," the process server announced before, immediately turning around and walking back to his sedan. Carter looked down at the thick envelope in his trembling hands. He slowly peeled back the metal clasp and pulled out the crisp, white documents inside. I watched his eyes scan the front page. Even from inside the studio, I could pinpoint the exact second his brain processed the bold black letterhead printed at the top of the divorce petition. My mother had not hired just any lawyer. She had retained the services of the most ruthless, ferociously expensive family law firm in the entire state. They were apex predators in the courtroom, famous for completely dismantling the lives of narcissistic spouses. The documents outlined a total asset freeze, a demand for the immediate return of my $80,000 penthouse deposit, and an airtight injunction preventing him from ever contacting me again. He was getting absolutely nothing. The marriage was officially legally terminated, and his destruction was now a matter of public record. The cheap grocery store flowers slipped from Carter's grip and fell onto the dirty sidewalk. He stared at the divorce papers, his mouth hanging open in silent, irreversible devastation. I did not stay by the window to watch Carter slowly crumble onto the pavement. I simply turned my back, picked up my sable paintbrush, and went right back to work. The divorce papers were merely the opening act of a completely spectacular, highly systematic dismantling of the Reynolds family empire. Over the next few weeks, I received regular, highly detailed updates from my mother's legal team, and watching the dominoes fall was the most satisfying experience of my entire life. The first domino to tip over was Carter's living situation. Exactly 2 days after he was served outside my studio, the luxury building management deactivated his electronic key fob. Since my mother's firm now owned the debt on the property, and the lease was technically in my name, with my security deposit, Carter was legally classified as an unauthorized occupant. The man who had arrogantly threatened to lock me out of my own home was forcibly escorted off the premises by the building security. He was given exactly 1 hour to pack his expensive tailored suits into cheap cardboard boxes, while the concierge watched his every single move. Carter, the former vice president of a fake empire, was forced to haul his pathetic boxes into a budget motel on the edge of the city, a place he would have previously scoffed at even driving past. The second domino was the family business. When the 48-hour deadline to repay the $30 million commercial loan expired, Richard Reynolds desperately tried to bluff his way out. He called in every single favor he had in the financial district, begging his wealthy friends for a massive emergency bridge loan. But the gossip from the anniversary party had already spread through the city like wildfire. Nobody wanted to touch the Reynolds name. They were financially radioactive. With absolutely zero options left, and his accounts completely frozen by my mother's aggressive legal team, Richard was forced to march into federal court and officially file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The massive Reynolds commercial real estate sign was quietly unbolted from the front of their downtown office building, leaving behind nothing but a faded, dirty outline on the brick wall. The absolute destruction of his company shattered Richard's fragile ego, but the final devastating blow was deeply personal. Defending against my mother's army of corporate litigators required an exorbitant amount of cash, something the Reynolds patriarch no longer possessed. To simply keep his defense attorneys on a basic retainer, Richard was forced to systematically liquidate his most prized personal assets. He sold his vintage car collection. He mortgaged his sprawling suburban estate. But the ultimate soul-crushing humiliation came when he was forced to quietly sell his exclusive, highly coveted membership to the Oak Ridge Country Club. The very same club where he had stood at a podium and publicly called me a charity case. The club management did not even offer him a polite farewell. They simply emptied his premium mahogany locker into a plastic garbage bag and mailed it to his foreclosed house. The prominent politicians and elite investors who used to drink his expensive wine suddenly stopped returning his phone calls. He became a total ghost in the city he once claimed to own. While Richard and Carter were drowning in a sea of corporate litigation, the toxic Reynolds family dynamic turned completely inward. As my mother had perfectly predicted, the moment the money dried up, the parasites began eating their own. Andre, the hotshot corporate lawyer, who had spent 5 years desperately kissing the ground Richard walked on, possessed incredible professional survival instincts. The absolute second the Chapter 11 bankruptcy was officially filed, Andre realized there was absolutely zero inheritance left for him to leech off. He immediately moved his personal funds into an untouchable offshore account, packed his custom suits, and moved out of the massive suburban house he shared with Penelope. Penelope was completely blindsided. She called him frantically, begging him to stay and help her family navigate the legal nightmare. Instead of comfort, Andre served her with expedited divorce papers. And because Andre was exactly the kind of ruthless, calculating monster he had always been, he used the exact same aggressive legal tactics against his own wife that he had tried to use on me. He enforced an ironclad prenuptial agreement that Penelope had naively signed years ago when she believed her family's wealth would protect her forever. Penelope was left with absolutely nothing. Her leased luxury sports car was aggressively repossessed from her driveway in the middle of the night. Her country club privileges were permanently revoked. The arrogant woman who had laughed at the thought of me being thrown onto the freezing street was suddenly forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely cut off from the high society world that had defined her entire pathetic existence. Without her designer clothes and borrowed diamonds, Penelope was completely invisible. The Reynolds family had spent their entire lives treating people like disposable garbage because they believed their money made them untouchable gods. They had built their entire identities on an arrogant illusion of power, And in less than a month, my mother and I had completely burned that illusion to the ground, leaving them to sweep up their own ashes. 2 weeks after the country club incident, the bell above my studio door chimed. I turned around and finally saw my mother. She was not flanked by her usual wall of executive assistants or security personnel. Josephine Sinclair stood entirely alone in the entryway of my messy downtown art studio, wearing a pristine cream cashmere coat that stood in stark contrast to the paint-splattered floorboards. She carried 2 paper cups of black coffee from a small roaster down the street. It was the most normal I had ever seen her look. She walked over to my workbench, navigating around a stack of heavy wooden frames, and set 1 cup down next to my palette. I wiped my hands on an old rag and picked up the cup. We stood in comfortable silence, staring at the large 19th century landscape I was currently restoring. I expected her to make a condescending comment about the dust or the lack of profit margins in art restoration. Instead, she leaned closer to the canvas, her icy blue eyes tracing the delicate brushstrokes in the sky. "You have a genuinely remarkable gift for fixing broken things, Madeline," she said softly. "It is a talent I never possessed. I only know how to tear them down." I took a slow sip of coffee and smiled. "Tearing things down is exactly what the toxic Reynolds family needed," I replied. "But you were right about them from the beginning. You warned me 5 years ago they were nothing but a fragile house of cards, and I refused to listen." My mother turned her gaze away from the painting and looked directly at me. "Why did you hide?" she asked, her voice stripped of its usual corporate edge, leaving behind a rare maternal vulnerability. "You dropped the Sinclair name and walked away from an empire. You let a family of arrogant, leveraged frauds treat you like the hired help for half a decade. I gave you every resource in the world, and you chose to scrub their floors." "Why?" I set my cup down and took a deep breath. "Because I needed to know if I actually existed without the money," I explained, looking her squarely in the eyes. "Growing up, every person who smiled at me, every friend who invited me over, every boy who asked me out, they were all looking at the Sinclair Trust Fund. I was never a person to them. I was just a bank account." When I met Carter, I wanted to build a life entirely from scratch. I wanted to know what it felt like to be loved and valued just for being Maddie. I wanted to prove my own talent was enough to earn a genuine seat at the table. My mother listened quietly, her expression softening into a look of profound understanding. "And you found out that the world is incredibly eager to exploit women who do not fiercely protect their own value," she stated factually. I nodded slowly. "I learned it the hard way," I admitted. "But why did you let me do it? You have the power to crush economies. You could have easily destroyed Richard Reynolds 5 years ago and dragged me back to Manhattan. Why did you stand by and let me play the victim?" "Because a cage is still a cage, even if it is built by your own mother," she replied smoothly. "If I had forced you to leave Carter 5 years ago, you would have hated me for the rest of your life. You would have always wondered if he was your true love. You had to see the harsh reality of the world for yourself. You needed to learn the difference between people who respect you and people who simply use you. I knew the Reynolds family would eventually become too arrogant to maintain their facade. I knew they would push you to the absolute edge. I just had to wait patiently for the exact moment you finally remembered who you really are." I looked at the powerful, incredibly wealthy woman standing calmly in my messy art studio. For my entire life I had viewed her as an overbearing titan I desperately needed to escape. But standing there drinking cheap black coffee together, the massive wall between us completely dissolved. We were no longer a billionaire CEO and a runaway rebellious daughter. We were simply 2 fiercely independent women who understood the exact price of freedom in a world dominated by mediocre men. I reached out and gently squeezed her arm. "Thank you for waiting for me," I said softly. My mother offered a small, genuine smile. "Welcome back, Madeline," she replied. 6 months after that quiet cup of coffee, the bell above my tiny downtown studio door rang for the absolute last time. I carefully packed up my sable paintbrushes, my expensive chemical solvents, and my delicate canvases. I turned the deadbolt, permanently locking the door on the quiet, accommodating woman who used to hide from her own shadow. I did not need a cramped, hidden workspace anymore. I needed a kingdom of my own design. I stood on the bustling, tree-lined sidewalk of the city's upscale arts district, looking up at the stunning, massive facade of my brand-new building. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, completely flooding the interior with warm, natural light. It was a sprawling 5,000-square-foot architectural masterpiece. The space featured beautifully exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and soaring industrial ceilings crisscrossed with sleek, modern track lighting. It was not a damp, windowless basement in a luxury high-rise where I was forced to quietly scrub dirty canvases out of sight. It was the premier gallery and restoration laboratory in the entire state, and it belonged entirely to me. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped inside, the rhythmic, confident click of my designer heels echoing through the expansive, pristine space. The front half of the building was a gorgeous, high-end fine arts gallery. Carefully curated pieces hung on the immaculate white partition walls, perfectly illuminated and ready for the grand opening gala scheduled for that very evening. But the true heart of the massive building was located in the back. Behind a seamless wall of soundproof UV-protected glass was my new restoration lab. It was a state-of-the-art facility equipped with custom ventilation hoods, microscopic analysis stations, and massive adjustable drafting tables built from solid oak. It was a professional space strictly designed for a master of the craft, not a submissive wife playing with a little basement hobby. I walked over to the main reception desk, running my hand along the smooth, cold surface of the imported white marble. I had not asked my mother for a single charitable handout to build this massive dream. The initial capital came directly from my own carefully hoarded savings, heavily bolstered by the $80,000 penthouse security deposit her ruthless legal team had successfully clawed back from Carter during the rapid divorce proceedings. But securing a commercial lease and funding a renovation of this incredible magnitude required serious high-level financial backing. So I did exactly what any confident, highly intelligent business owner would do. I marched directly into the towering glass headquarters of Sinclair Holdings, sat across the mahogany boardroom table from the billionaire CEO, and formally pitched my comprehensive business plan. My mother did not give me a gift. She gave me a highly structured, fiercely negotiated commercial business loan with a strict repayment schedule and a highly competitive interest rate. She treated me like a serious, high-level corporate investment, and I eagerly signed the massive stack of legal contracts with my own pen. It was the ultimate display of mutual respect between two powerful women. I was finally playing in her elite financial league, but I was playing strictly by my own rules. I walked toward the front of the gallery and turned around to look at the massive front window from the inside. Emblazoned across the thick, spotless glass, in elegant, understated gold leaf lettering, was the name of the new business: Sinclair Restoration and Fine Arts. Seeing my actual name shining brightly in the morning sun sent a powerful electric thrill straight down my spine. For 5 agonizing years, I had completely erased myself. I had desperately tried to shrink my intelligence, my ambition, and my family heritage, just to comfortably fit inside the tiny, fragile box Carter Reynolds had built for me. I had willingly played the role of the quiet, accommodating nobody because I falsely believed that making myself smaller was the only way to earn a mediocre man's love. I had let a family of arrogant, leveraged frauds treat me like disposable garbage because I was too terrified to wield my own immense power. But that scared, submissive woman no longer existed. She had been completely burned away in the fires of the Oak Ridge Country Club lobby. I smoothed the crisp fabric of my tailored emerald green blazer. I did not wear cheap, faded overalls today. I was dressed flawlessly, carrying myself with the exact same predatory, unbreakable posture my mother possessed. I was no longer hiding in the shadows of a fake high society empire. I was standing firmly in the blinding center of my own very real, highly profitable reality. I was a master art restorer. I was a fiercely independent business owner. I was Madeline Sinclair, and I finally understood the absolute undeniable value of my own name. I took a deep breath of the crisp gallery air, letting that absolute certainty settle into my bones. Then I turned my gaze away from the gold leaf lettering on the front window. I am no longer looking at my own reflection. I am looking directly at you. Yes, you. The person listening to this story right now. You have been walking silently alongside me through the dark basement, the suffocating country club lobby, and the glorious fiery destruction of the Reynolds Empire. I know exactly why you stayed to listen to every single word, because parts of my story are actually your story. You know exactly what it feels like to be trapped in that lobby. We are taught from a very young age that love requires compromise. We are told that keeping the peace is a virtue. But somewhere along the line, toxic people twist that beautiful concept into something incredibly dangerous. They convince us that compromise means complete self-erasure. I spent 5 entire years making myself deliberately smaller so my husband and his family could feel massive. I muted my intelligence because my success deeply threatened his fragile, unearned ego. I hid my family name, my immense wealth, and my natural authority because I desperately thought being ordinary would make me worthy of a normal, uncomplicated love. I folded myself up, crammed myself into a tiny, suffocating box, and handed them the key. I completely believed that my quiet obedience would eventually be rewarded with genuine respect and affection. But here is the absolute terrifying truth about toxic people. They do not appreciate your quiet sacrifices. They actively prey on them. When you make yourself small to accommodate their deep insecurities, they do not see an act of selfless love. They see a glaring admission of weakness. They see a boundary they can violently cross without consequence. They see a permanent target. The Reynolds family did not hate me because they thought I was poor, or because I washed dirty canvases in a dark basement. They hated me because my very existence, even muted and hidden, reminded them of everything they lacked. They were entirely hollow people, built entirely on bad commercial debt and fake country club arrogance. They desperately needed a scapegoat to carry the crushing weight of their own miserable, systemic failures. Do not make the exact same mistake I made. Stop dimming your brilliant light just to make other people comfortable in their own dark, miserable lives. Never apologize for the space you take up. You were not born to be a silent background character in someone else's pathetic delusion of grandeur. You have a powerful voice, you have absolute intrinsic value, and you have an undeniable right to exist at your full, unapologetic capacity. If they demand you to be small, do not shrink a single inch. Stand up completely straight, square your shoulders, look them directly in the eyes, and introduce them to the giant standing behind you. That giant might be your fiercely protective mother arriving in a tailored suit. It might be your chosen family. Or most importantly, it might just be the massive, unbreakable version of yourself that you have been terrified to finally unleash. Now it is your turn to take the power back. I want to hear your stories. Go down to the comment section right now and tell me about the exact moment you finally stopped shrinking for other people. Tell me about the toxic family members you bravely cut off, the personal boundaries you fiercely defended, and the beautiful empires you are currently building entirely from scratch. Share your victories, no matter how small they might seem, because your survival story could be the exact blueprint someone else needs to finally escape their own toxic cage. We are building a massive, unstoppable community of survivors here. We are a network of independent, unapologetic people who absolutely refuse to be bullied by fake authorities and fragile narcissists ever again. Before you leave this video to go conquer your own world, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of absolute, highly satisfying justice. We are going to expose the frauds, reclaim our power, and celebrate our freedom together. We are just getting started, and I promise you the best revenge is always a beautiful life lived entirely on your own terms. Thank you for walking this incredible journey with me. Stay fierce, stay unapologetic, and never ever forget exactly who you are.